All right, ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to a special Sunday session of the Modjeska Simkins School for Human Rights. Of course, I'm leading instructor for the school, Dr. Robert Green II, and I am pleased and honored to introduce to our audience this afternoon a good friend of the Progressive Network, Bill Fletcher. Bill Fletcher has been heavily involved in radical social movements for decades. He has written several books. He is both a writer of nonfiction and also fiction. In fact, I'm going to put in the chat links to his most recent works, including The Man Who Changed Colors and his other mystery novel, The Man Who Fell from the Sky. Both excellent works of fiction that I have enjoyed reading myself. Also, Mr. Fletcher has been, again, heavily involved with a variety of social movements. At one point, he was president of Trans-Africa Forum, a senior scholar for the Institute for Policy Studies. He's also had extensive experience working with the AFL-CIO and other organizations in the labor movement. Now, this afternoon, we've invited Bill Fletcher to talk a bit about basically the state of things right now. Of course, you may have heard that this year is a presidential election year, but more than that, for many Americans, it feels like a genuine inflection point in both American and global history. And so it's a genuine treat to hear from someone like Bill Fletcher talk about these issues because he's spent decades thinking about them in a holistic and forthright manner. And most importantly of all, Bill Fletcher, as all good radicals and activists are, is also a big Star Trek fan. So for that reason alone, Bill Fletcher is worth listening to. So could we all give Mr. Fletcher a warm round of applause?
Thank you. Thank you very much, Dr. Green and the South Carolina Progressive Network, and for each of you for joining this when I'm sure that there's many other things you could be doing on a Sunday afternoon. The instructions I was given for what I was to talk about could take us several hours to cover. But we're not going to do that. I want to talk for no more than 45 minutes, probably less. Make sure that there's time for us to have a discussion as a group. And in trying to think how to frame this, I want to tell a story, essentially of decisions that were made by the far right and decisions that were made by liberals and progressives around the same time and with dramatically different results that we're living with today. And so when I'm talking about liberals and progressives, I'm talking about there's obviously a wide range there. I'm not just speaking about the left. I'm talking particularly about those of us that have wanted to introduce significant structural reforms in the system and to push it in more and more of a democratic with a small d direction. In the late 60s, mid to late 60s, there was what I would call the King dilemma. And I call it the King dilemma because it was most evident in the thinking and work of Dr. King in the final 2 years of his life. The leading force at that time was the Black Freedom Movement. The anti-war movement was running second and becoming, close up on that. And in the aftermath of the victories of the 64 Civil Rights Act and the 65 Voting Rights Act, there was this dilemma. Question is, where next? Where should the Black Freedom Movement move, and movements that had been allied with it? And it was in that period, in those final 2 years of King's life, that we start to see him very openly articulating the importance of what we'll call economic justice and global justice, and connecting that to the fight around racial justice. So it wasn't that King was abandoning the fight around racial justice, but he was adding on very explicitly, because these had always been important to King, but he adds them on explicitly as the direction that he believes that a progressive movement in the United States should be going. This decision was highly controversial because many of the liberals who had been, sorry,
Uh-oh.
sorry about that. Many of the liberals who had been aligned with King were deeply afraid of this move. They were deeply afraid of particularly his stance announced publicly in 1967 against the Vietnam War. But they were also deeply concerned about his arguments around economic justice and essentially what turns out to be the Poor People's Campaign. And so there wasn't real unity, certainly in the Black Freedom Movement and with many allied movements, about these directions. So when King is killed in 1968, there is a sort of strategic plateau that is reached by popular movements. And they had trouble getting off of that plateau. And this becomes a real challenge. From that point on, from particularly 1972, we see a few different things happening. One is an obsession with what you could call the politics of representation over the politics of substance. So representation, particularly in terms of identity, as opposed to substance and structural reforms, that I would call a politics of power. There was also the growth of abstentionism by many of the more radical elements who basically concluded that, in effect, nothing could be done at a reform level, and even fighting for structural reforms, and that, in effect, we had to wait for the right moment for some sort of radical transformation. And so there was this real gap in the minds of many people between where we were, where we needed to be, and not thinking about, okay, what are the next steps? So we were often bouncing around. Almost philosophically, this was rooted in a very linear view of change. And this idea that was in many ways epitomized by the wonderful quote from King himself, where he says that the arc of history is long, but it bends towards justice. And the problem with that is that it's wrong. The arc of history is long, but it doesn't bend in any particular direction. It bends all over the place, depending on what people do or do not do. And so if you basically believe that progress is inevitable, I'm sorry for all this noise. Excuse me 1 second. Apologies. If you believe that progress is inevitable, then you don't really have to worry about a regression. You focus more in terms of sort of stability and moving things forward, but you don't take into account that things actually can go backwards. That leads to the second story. So around the same time as King was grappling with which way to go, there were forces on the right that were trying to figure out the same thing. And these were forces that largely came out of the Goldwater campaign for president in 1964. And these forces were deeply disturbed by the victory of various progressive movements and wanted to block that and turn it around. But they weren't quite sure how. But they then started identifying certain keys. One was watching the growth of the Wallace movement, beginning in Alabama and then spreading throughout the South and spreading nationally, George Wallace. They started watching this, and they made a decision, very, very important decision. The decision was to try to enter in and remain in the Republican Party and push the Republican Party further and further to the right, purging the Republican Party over time of its liberal wing in its entirety. Now, in order to do this, they thought far more strategically than most progressives did. They basically started thinking in terms of what was their strategic objective. Their strategic objective was to overthrow the 20th century. Now, that may sound hyperbolic, but what I mean by that was their objective was to reverse the victories that the people's movements had gained since about 1912, including but not limited to the New Deal. And they wanted to reverse that. And different elements of this new right, as it came to be known, had various ideas as to what would be the point in history they'd want to return to. Grover Norquist, the father, so-called, of the anti-tax movement, his idea was the time of William McKinley, the president of the United States in 1898. And others had other ideas, the 1920s, et cetera. But they wanted to reverse all this. There were other elements, like the person that becomes a Supreme Court Justice, Lewis Powell, who was completely panicked about the growing strength of the progressive forces and wrote the notorious Powell Memorandum, where he called for essentially a counterattack against what he identified as anti-capitalist forces and the creation, among other things, of institutions that would promote pro-capitalist, explicitly pro-capitalist thinking and other forms of right-wing thinking. And so they go about doing this. Now, how the right does this is incredibly intriguing because they operate basically on four levels. One, after having established the strategic objective, they engage in litigation, political and legislative action, mass movements, and institution building. All four of those. And so, for example, in litigation, you see these attacks on affirmative action beginning very early. That is soon followed by, after 1973, with litigation around abortion. And then there's other forms of litigation that take place. Political and legislative. Their effort was to particularly build clear base areas in the South and the Southwest and move out of there, particularly into the Midwest, and lay a basis at the statewide level for change in a rightward direction. And there was no office that was too low for the far right to concentrate on taking. You know, people often joke about them going after position of dog catcher. They'd go after anything because what they understood was that the amount that can be influenced at the local level and the issue of changing consciousness. There was a saying by a West German leftist, Rudi Dutschek, I think his name was, who basically talked about marching through the institutions. He was a leftist. The right had that approach of marching through the institutions, taking them and transforming them to carry out their work. They also did not fear making alliances. So the architects of the new right understood their own strengths and weaknesses And in 1968, they took advantage of the presidential campaign of Richard Nixon in order to build an alliance with someone that they despised. People like Richard Viguerie and others from the New Right despised Richard Nixon, who they viewed as a liberal and completely untrustworthy. Nixon said, we're all New Dealers. And people like Viguerie and others, Weirich and others, were not. But they engaged in an alliance with Nixon because Nixon opened up doors. And in his 68 campaign, with the whole themes of the silent majority, the Southern strategy, and law and order, all of those were fundamentally about race, but also the repression of the left. And they were all coded. Viguerie, Weirich, and others saw the possibilities of an alliance there, and they seized upon it. And they looked at that as better positioning them for what they recognized to be an effort to ultimately transform the Republican Party. So Nixon comes and goes, but the New Right strengthens itself, and that also the strengthening included mass movements. The mass movements were anti-abortion, anti-busing, anti-Panama Canal Treaty. The list goes on and on. And this lays the foundation for the Reagan victory in 1980. Whether Reagan would have won had there not been an October surprise is something we could discuss. But it laid the foundation for all of this. And the Reagan Revolution was the alliance with these forces from the New Right, plus the articulation of neoliberal globalization, that is capitalist fundamentalism, which was beginning to gain steam under Jimmy Carter, but takes on a qualitatively different form under Reagan and begins a very active push to the right that we have been dealing with. Now, during this time, progressive and liberal forces were either in denial or they were fighting simply a defensive battle. The denial is something that I sarcastically describe as the plight of the man who jumped off the Empire State Building, who, when he fell past the 40th floor, was overheard saying, "So far, so good." And for many of us, that's what happened. That the fact that we had not hit bottom led many people to believe that it couldn't really be that bad. While the ground is coming up at us. And so you had an over-reliance on litigation. For instance, the opposing the right-wing attacks on abortion was largely done through court action. And there was a basic belief that Roe v. Wade could not be overcome, that it would not be overthrown, that it would remain, that it might be whittled down, but it would remain. There was not an assumption that it could be overthrown. The right wing, however, was laying the foundation for the overthrow of Roe v. Wade by their political and legislative work at the statewide level, passing all of these laws that would be triggered if Roe v. Wade was overturned. And the efforts by many progressives to build real grassroots work at the statewide level to support pro-choice efforts was frequently ignored, not funded by foundations who believed, no, let's throw everything into litigation. And so the right wing was chipping away at the different things that we had been winning, while many of us believed it really couldn't be that bad. And after every defeat, there was frequently something in a liberal outfit or outlet that would say, in effect, well, it could have been worse. We dodged a bullet. Yes, we lost some things there, but it wasn't terrible. It could have been much worse. And yes, it could have been much worse. And we see that it has become much worse. But the idea of mounting a counterattack, we failed on that. So there was this retreat. Now there were attempts at a counterattack, and in the 1980s, the most significant was probably the black-led electoral upsurge that was epitomized by Jesse Jackson's two presidential campaigns, especially the 1988 campaign, and the idea of rainbow politics, and that the politics that needed to be elaborated was not simply about a black politics, but really was thinking in majoritarian terms. This idea of rainbow politics was running up against another problem that we started to face, and that was the rise of a sort of ethno-nationalist and what some people call identity politics, whereby people were falling into their specific group, their ethnicity, the so-called racial group, or some sort of identity, and believing that the fight could only be launched there, and that there was not the possibility of bringing these fights back together, which had been really the hallmark of what people like King, but also radical groups like the Panthers, the Young Lords, and others had been articulating in the 60s. There was a change, a shift away from that, more towards you fight on your own terms. And these fights tended more and more to be very defensive. The Jackson campaigns and rainbow politics was saying, no, we need to be building a movement of the majority. And unfortunately, even though many people mouth this, they didn't fully believe it or understand the implications. And one of the implications was the necessity for a national, grassroots, mass democratic organization that could operate inside and outside of the Democratic Party. Not the formation of a third party, which is very rare in US history, at least at the national level, because of the nature of US politics, but the need for an organization like the nonpartisan leagues from the 1930s that existed mainly in the Midwest, that were not parties, but they were party-like. And the basic vision for the rainbow, at least initially, was something like that. Unfortunately, for a variety of reasons, including Reverend Jackson's own errors, that did not come into existence. Now, another factor that has influenced where we are today, the troubling situation we are, is the end of the Cold War. Now, when the Cold War ended, there were a number of things that happened. At first, there was this idea that, as people put it at the time, peace was breaking out all over, and there would be a peace dividend because of the end of the Cold War. That discussion lasted for maybe 3.5 months, because all of a sudden, when Iraq invaded Kuwait and we had the first Gulf War, all of that changed. A second factor was the hubris in the United States with the idea from the ruling circles that the US had won the Cold War, and this attempt then to singularly dictate what the future of the planet should be. But something else happened that we don't give enough attention to, and it was domestic. Part of what kept the US ruling class together was the Cold War. The legacy of the Civil War has remained with us to this day. The Confederacy was militarily defeated, but not politically, and became a very important component of US ruling circles. The Cold War and the fight against the Soviet Union, China, the so-called fight against communism, kept these segments of the ruling class together to a great extent, and created a situation of, what's a good way of describing it? A sort of acceptable conditions, a modus vivendi among the ruling circle, within the ruling circle. When the common enemy disappears, this starts to fragment. And you start to see within the Republican Party the victory of the new right, the destruction or purging of most of the liberal wing, and the rise of people like Gingrich and others who start to push a more confrontational view. And they start to do something else too, which is something that had been more limited to the South and the Southwest, which is to start to appease the far right, including but not limited to the paramilitary far right. So we start to see more of that. And this is the kind of polarization that we've been living with. And the Oklahoma City bombing and the response of the Republicans to that, for instance, the covering of the paramilitary right by the Republican establishment over time was in part a reflection of this split that was happening within the ruling circles about matters of governance. The split also ultimately revolves around a crisis that's developing in the economy and the environment. And in that sense, we live at the convergence of these two massive crises, economic and environmental. It's like, as I always like to say metaphorically, it's like the convergence of two plates, tectonic plates. And when they converge, they can create earthquakes or they can create mountains. And we see this convergence, and that helps to explain why everybody is nervous and everybody stays anxious. There's nobody I know that isn't anxious. And part of that is because we all know that things are incredibly unstable. And the crisis that unleashes itself with the developing problems of neoliberal globalization poses a problem for the legitimacy of these capitalist states. Because the whole idea of democratic capitalism was supposed to be, I'm not saying I believe this, but the idea was that the state was ultimately supposed to be the final arbiter. And the state was supposed to make sure that in the last instance, there would be some sort of social net that would prevent most people from collapsing. Now, there was always a racial angle to this, in that the social safety net that arises in the New Deal, for instance, and in other welfare states around the world was particularly going to focus on, in the United States, the case of white people. But the idea of the welfare state was something that was really central to what the United States said that it was going to be. But as neoliberalism eats away at the welfare state and eats away at all of the assumptions many of us grew up with, and when neoliberalism starts to disempower governments, except at the level of repression, so that governments become less and less able to deliver. I don't mean that they're abstractly unable. What I mean is that there's all kinds of financial and legal restrictions on them imposed upon them that are accepted by political parties. And as this happens, people become less and less confident that government can resolve anything. And in that mix, you start to see both a rise of left-wing responses and right-wing responses. And the right-wing authoritarian responses are directly related to the end of the Cold War and the crisis of neoliberalism, brought on by neoliberalism, as well as the crisis brought on by what's happening with the environmental catastrophe. Because the environmental catastrophe has contributed to, although it's not the sole reason, to the massive influx of migrants all over the world. The planet is burning. People know that, and people are moving, and this is adding to the crisis that we find ourselves in. So the right wing has been systematically building a bloc, which some of us call a neo-Confederate bloc, that includes the corporate right and the far right. And these are folks that ultimately want to undermine what we understand as constitutional democracy. And they want to put into place governments that very openly are supporting the rich and the infamous and are crushing dissent. In some ways, it's a preemptive assault against the popular movements and the movements that the ruling circles, many of the ruling circles, anticipate will be emerging because of the economic and environmental crises. Now, another part of the ruling circles sees a different route, and they are looking for either a New Deal, neo-Keynesian people call it. Some people talk about green capitalism, but they're going in a different route. And so there's competition, and we see this at the political left all the time. There's this competition that's going on between which route for the future of capitalism. And it's within that situation that we progressives have to figure out what to do. Because at this point, we are unfortunately not at the level where we can win power. And by winning power, I'm not just talking as a socialist about winning socialism. I mean, win power in terms of progressive governance at the national level. At the national level, we're not there. But we are, in many places, in many states, well positioned to win major office, as well as to influence what happens in state government. We also are in a position where we can influence what happens at a national political level, although we're not going to be the ones that control the outcome. And that's why what happens in November becomes very, very important. Because what we see out of Trump and the MAGA right, and it's represented by what's called Project 2025, as well as what the American Legislative Exchange Council is proposing with the idea of a constitutional convention. They want to end all pretense of democratic rule, democratic with a small d. And they've been laying the foundation, and many people have missed this. They've been laying the foundation ideologically by saying things like, the US isn't a democracy, it's a republic. And just the other day, the Kansas Supreme Court, you may have heard this, issued a ruling where they said that the Constitution of Kansas does not guarantee the public, the citizens, a right to vote. See, this is all laying the foundation for what these characters want to do. And they're doing it one step at a time. And basically they're testing as they're going along to see at what point we come after them with pitchforks and torches. Or at what point do we sit back and just say, things could be worse. And so the outcome of the election becomes really critical, not in the sense that the election will bring us the kind of progressive outcome that we need. But it's the question of whether we can prevent what looks to be either fascism or what some people call post-fascism. That is a highly right-wing authoritarian system that in the United States would probably tend towards being a theocracy. And particularly if a constitutional convention is successful, we could have the United Theocratic States of America. And there's no exaggeration there. So that's where I think we are. And defeat is simply not an option. Defeat is the handmaid's tale. And it's simply not an option. To fight against this, we have to build strong organizations in every state. We have to strengthen our social movements, labor, the environmental, women's movements, LGBTQ, etc. We've got to fight to both defend but also to push forward regulations on businesses and not allow these people to be gutting us, not just gutting the regulations, but gutting us. And we need to be thinking in terms of winning. And that's where I'll end, which is that for too long, liberals and progressives have been thinking about defending and not thinking about winning. We've got to think in terms of winning. We've got to have a set of strategic objectives that we're fighting for that goes beyond the preservation of the status quo. People are suffering with the status quo. We need to fight for a real democracy. We need to democratize the United States. And that means a different kind of mobilization. It means a willingness to fight. And it means understanding the nature of our opponents. And our opponents seek to annihilate us. And that's not euphemism. I'm going to stop there, Dr. Green.
All right. Well, thank you so much for that, Mr. Fletcher. And I think, again, first, a round of applause for his comments this afternoon. And now is as good a time as any to open up the floor for questions. And I suspect folks have a lot of questions they want to ask this afternoon. So if you have questions, if you're at the Grow Building, feel free to ask questions, or if you're on Zoom, feel free to put questions in the chat or unmute yourself and ask your question. Any questions at all?
Dr. Green, I'll start it out with the observation that Bill Fletcher says what I've been thinking, words that are so much clearer than I've been able to articulate. Thank you, Bill. Thank you, sir.
Appreciate it.
I think that the state-based work that the Progressive Network has been doing has been on the track that Bill started about, but the questions of how we move it forward here are the immediate things we're dealing with now.
Absolutely. And to that end, Cecil, I see you have a question. Go ahead, please.
Thank you. And thank you, Mr. Fletcher. I caught a week ago an interview that you had with Van Goss and Phyllis Bennis that was published, I think, on Jacobin magazine or Jacobin.
Jacobin, yes.
Yes, sir. You made a couple of statements in response to their question about whether you still believe that the practice of internationalism by the global left and progressive movements is confused and stuck in old habits and discourses left over from the era of third world liberation, beginning early in the 20th century and the Cold War. Obviously, a week later, I think you still believe that, and you have described really well today, especially that Cold War part I have not really given a lot of thought to. But the other thing you said was there's a growing strategic question being posed globally around what one does under very adverse circumstances when there don't appear to be nonviolent options. So, but I've got two questions. You described basically what hasn't worked for the progressive or left movement. Should those strategies be dumped altogether, or can they be retooled in some way to be more effective? And my second question is, do you think we're fast approaching the time when there doesn't appear to be a nonviolent option left to pursue. And I'll leave it in that. I do have one other question about Paulo Freire, if you don't mind, later. Thank you.
Sure. Dr. Green, do you want me to take multiple questions, or do you mind if I respond? How do you want to proceed?
Oh, sure. You can go ahead and answer multiple questions at once. That's totally fine.
Okay. There's a fundamental difference between strategies and tactics. And there are tactics that have been used throughout time, like sit-ins, that still have a value, boycotts. Strategies need to reflect an understanding of the moment. And it needs to understand the nature, as Sun Tzu, who wrote in The Art of War, know your enemy and know yourself, and you can fight 100 battles without fear of defeat. So a strategy has to reflect understanding the nature of your opponent, their capabilities, their objectives, etc., as well as understanding your own. So in that sense, strategies are constantly reinvented. You can look to old strategies for lessons. And this is something that happens in warfare, where people will study the strategies that were used by Hannibal against the Romans. But that doesn't mean you replicate it exactly. You draw lessons from it. And that's what I would say. We draw lessons from the strategies that have been articulated in the past. And one of the most important things to keep in mind is that we are in an asymmetric fight with our opponents. We're not equivalent. They are stronger than us in virtually every way, in terms of money, media control, etc. The thing we have is people. And when you have an asymmetric fight, you don't take on your opponent the way your opponent wants to. Let me give you a military analogy. May of 2024 was the 70th anniversary of the famous Battle of Dien Bien Phu that took place in Vietnam in 1954, and where the French were defeated by the Vietnamese, and that ended French control of Indochina. Now, the French were largely defeated because their strategy was flawed. They basically decided to set up a major base area with four or five forts in a valley, supply themselves through the air, so not worry about being cut off by the roads, and create a situation where they were encouraging the Viet Minh, the revolutionaries, to attack using frontal assaults. Now, had the Viet Minh done that, they might have been annihilated. But instead, under the brilliant leadership of General Vo Nguyen Giap, they brought in heavy artillery, which the French knew that the Vietnamese could never bring in. They didn't worry about it. But they brought it in through the mountains. They put the artillery up in the mountains, and they blasted the hell out of the French. And they destroyed the ability of the French to be resupplied from the air. And ultimately, they were able to destroy the French. So in other words, they didn't fight a battle on the terms that the French had created. They fought the battle on different terms. And so we have to always understand, in going up against our opponents, that they're going to want to encourage us to fight certain kinds of battles that will weaken us or that are to their advantage. We have to be thinking about other things, other ways of weakening them. So, for instance, in South Carolina, it's a right-to-work state. But South Carolina at least used to, I don't know what it still does, have certain legal protections against workers being fired, even if there's no union. And so, to what extent does such a law get utilized to undermine our opponents? I think our opponents want people to forget or not know that such laws exist anywhere. So how do you think about undermining our opponents in ways that play to our strengths as opposed to theirs? So that's a general approach to strategy. I'm not going to articulate a strategy. That's not my role here, but that's the general approach. In terms of the second question about violence, the short answer is I don't know. But what I do know is that social movements have to be prepared to protect themselves against violent assaults. And many of us have forgotten this. And many of us have drawn the wrong lessons from the civil rights movement, forgetting that it was groups like the Deacons for Defense that made the nonviolence of Martin Luther King possible. No, not about holding press conferences, but there were people that were prepared to defend civil rights workers. So there's always the question of self-defense. Even in situations where democratic, small d, action is very limited, people have to be very careful before they resort to offensive violence. It's something that has to be looked at only in terms of the extent to which there is mass support, that is, masses of people believe that there's no other option. But it also is not something that someone engages in recklessly. So right now, I think we have to concentrate on nonviolent forms of action, but that doesn't mean being passive. We need to be fighting to win. We need to be fighting for power. That's the thing we've got to keep in mind. And we need to defend ourselves. And we need to be prepared to identify and defend ourselves against provocations. And I'll give you an example. And we see it right now. In the aftermath of the guilty verdict for Trump, there are many MAGA forces that are very threatening. They're threatening all forms of violence. Now, if they attack, we defend. But we can't use their provocations as an excuse to do something that could set off a whole chain of events we're not prepared for. So we've got to be prepared and understand that the right wing wants to provoke. They have a whole idea, acceleration, some of them call it. And they have other terms that they're using for wanting to provoke a race war. And we have to be very, very careful.
All right, excellent. Okay, up next is Becky. Then there are a couple of questions in the chat we'll get to as well. So Becky, go ahead, please.
Thank you. I really appreciate the measured response there to a tough question. And I'm really interested to know what you had to say about working in broad coalitions, because that's what the network was founded on, and what it still is at the heart of the work that we do, is working in as broad a coalition as we can. And I think that one of the things that we've seen over the couple of decades that we've been at this is that manifestation of identity politics that you mentioned, and how that serves to fracture any kind of really solid movement building. I wonder what the heart of my question is, what do you think that the pro-Palestinian movement, how that either can serve to fracture us further on the left, or is it a way to, I mean, in South Carolina even, it's mobilized young people in a way that's it's new, at least for the last many years. And so I'm just wondering what your thoughts are, what the impact and implications are of pro-Palestinian movements, and how that affects our work, either in the short term or long term.
So let me divide that question into two. The first is about broad coalitions. There is a big difference between progressives and the right wing when it comes to coalitions. For many progressives, if people don't agree on 99% of things, we treat them as enemies. The right wing is exactly the opposite. The right wing, when they build coalitions, all you have to agree on is the purpose of that coalition, and they look at you as a friend. And this is one of the very important lessons we should learn from what happened in the 1970s. When the right wing began these mass coalitions, anti-busing, anti-abortion, anti-Panama Canal Treaty, participation in these coalitions was not preconditioned on your believing anything else. You could be anti-busing and pro-abortion. They'd say, fine. You could be anti-abortion and pro-busing. They'd say, fine. You could be anti-abortion. You could be pro-abortion and pro-busing, but anti-Panama Canal Treaty. And they'd say, fine. Come into the coalition on the Panama Canal. We tend not to work that way. One of the experiences I had when we built United for Peace and Justice in the lead up to the Iraq War was that there were forces who will go nameless, but a rival coalition that kept raising the bar and kept baiting us for not being pure enough as progressives, that we had to have a whole set of points, as opposed to saying, are you against the US invading Iraq? You are? Then there's a home for you here. So the issue of purity is what's killing us. And it's infantile in the extreme. And it's just amazing. It's like when I mentioned before about the new right and Nixon. I mean, when I say that they despised him, that's not an overstatement. They absolutely despised Nixon. But they understood the value of an alliance with him. Many of us, it's like, no, it's a purity scale. In terms of Palestine, I have never seen, nor do I think there ever has been, the kind of movement we're seeing around Palestine in US history. There's always been a Zionist movement that's been very vocal, but not a pro-Palestinian movement like we're seeing. And I think that this is amazing and it's tremendous and badly needed. And as much as I don't want to see Trump elected, I think it'd be a disaster, I don't see the question of whether you're pro-Palestinian and putting pressure on Biden versus whether you're going to vote for Biden. I don't look at it like that. I look at it as we put pressure on Biden and we keep putting pressure on Biden. But we can't have Trump in office. I think that the pro-Palestinian movement, though, has a strategic quandary that is in some ways the result of its successes at the mass level. And it revolves around what next? And how does one sustain this momentum or take the momentum and refocus it? We had much the same question in the aftermath of the George Floyd uprisings of 2020, where historic mobilizations that actually resulted in nothing. Nothing. I mean, there was some reforms that were won temporarily, but the counterattack, because we didn't build anything that sustained itself, the counterattack from the right has been absolutely vicious. Looking at what DeSantis has done in Florida is just a case in point. So I think that there's this question about what's next. And I think for the Palestinian movement, there's probably a few things which are very important. One is there needs to be a permanent legislative electoral presence for pro-Palestinian forces in every state. We need to be visible and loud. And we need to be pushing back on various things that the right wing is trying to do. The second thing is closer connections with the boycott, divestment, sanctions movement. And there, I think that the critical thing is much more systematic targeting in order to make breakthroughs. Part of what's happened with the BDS movement in the United States is that it's taken on a form that's much like the trade union movement's boycott list. The National AFL-CIO has a boycott list of all these companies that have screwed over workers that you're supposed to boycott. And the problem is that boycott lists are completely ineffective. A boycott is an act of war, and it needs to be treated as such. When you engage in a boycott, you're not simply putting out a call for people not to go somewhere or buy some product. You're basically calling for the strangulation of a target. You're surrounding them and cutting off oxygen, metaphorically. You're basically trying to build a situation where they are isolated. And so that means, as the United Farm Workers demonstrated in the Great Boycott, for instance, you need to deploy people around the country. You need to be at stores, encouraging people to boycott grapes, in that case. You need to be figuring out other mechanisms for putting pressure on targets. All of those things. This is an ongoing effort. And you also have to know when to end it and how to end it. In 1972, I was partially inspired to go to Harvard because I went up to take a look at the school after I got accepted, and there was a takeover of one of the administrative buildings. And the demand was for Harvard to divest its holdings in Gulf Oil, because Gulf Oil was investing in then Portuguese-controlled Angola. And so there was this national boycott of Gulf Oil. That was 1972. I don't think that I've bought Gulf Oil since then. I mean, nobody told me the boycott was over, right? And I don't know, I just never stopped boycotting them. That's ridiculous. At some point, somebody should have said, okay, the boycott's over. Coors Beer, right? There's been a boycott of Coors Beer since, I think, the 1970s. I don't know whether it's still on. I don't know what the point is anymore. See, that's like a frivolous view of boycotts. When you're thinking about boycotts, you've got to be thinking about how does it help to position us to take down our opponent. And I think that that's part of what the pro-Palestinian movement will have to look at, as well as some other things around democracy. Like, we need to be fighting these laws that have been passed in a number of states that say you can't have a contract with the state if you're calling for BDS, other kinds of ridiculous things.
All right. That's a really informative answer. So I want to go to the chat because April had a couple of questions here, and I think you've already answered a good bit of the first question she posed about the issue of identity politics and kind of dividing the left. And I think we'll come back to that a bit more later on too. But I want to get to April's second question, which is this. What role do you think the current attacks on free speech from both parties plays in changing the strategies available to us? Given the state has a monopoly on physical violence, it seems they are very focused now on modes of communication. It makes me think that one strategy is bringing back printed information versus relying exclusively on the digital space. So I think, again, Bill, this is a question about tactics and strategy and the utility of free speech with both of those.
Yeah, what a fascinating question. I mean, all these questions are great, and I really appreciate them. April, I think you have to begin in the late 1970s with the slow rise of neoliberal globalization. There was a transformation that you start to see in Western, in advanced capitalist states. It's something that the noted theorist Nikos Poulantzas called authoritarian statism. And to put it in another way, you start to see this growth of authoritarianism moving slowly that is compressing the parameters of legitimacy slowly. In other words, it's basically through the media and other means saying what's legitimate and what's not. And if you look, for instance, Richard Nixon's domestic policies, with the exception of his war against social movements, were to the left of Bill Clinton's. And most people would find that frightening to believe that. But the parameters have been shrinking so that when Clinton was called a socialist, there's nothing that could be more absurd. Well, the same with Obama. Part of authoritarianism has been the shrinking of parameters and the limiting of debate. And that's part of what we've been seeing. And I think you're right that this has been bipartisan. The Republicans are far more open about it, but it's been a bipartisan tendency. And by bipartisan, I don't mean everybody in the Democratic Party, but damn sure virtually everybody in the Republican Party has been articulating this. So in response, the central component to a progressive movement needs to be the fight for consistent democracy, the fight for the expansion of democracy. So that again, the status quo is not to our benefit. We need to be expanding democracy in all spheres. This is one of the reasons that I don't believe that there's something called culture wars. I don't think that there's culture wars. I think that there's wars around democracy. I think that the attacks on LGBTQ people is not about culture, it's about democracy. The attack on abortion is not about culture. It's an attack on democracy and the question of who decides a woman's body, men or women, right? It's about democracy. And so we've got to be pushing forward the battle around democracy and expanding that. So part of that to me means a new free speech movement. And there's been two free speech movements in US history. One that was launched by the industrial workers of the world in the first decade of the 20th century. And the second was in the 60s, coming out of Berkeley, UC Berkeley. And free speech movements are very important when we're challenging the parameters that are put on us and using the First Amendment, not the Fifth Amendment, but using the First Amendment to articulate what needs to happen. I do think you're onto something around printed information and digital, but I would frame it somewhat differently. I think that we need a new literacy movement in the United States. I think we need to teach people how to read and how to read analytically. I don't mean just simply the A, B's, and C's, although damn sure there's a whole lot of people that need the A, B's, and C's, but how to read analytically, and to not assume that because something's on Wikipedia, with all due respect to Wikipedia, that it's legitimate, or worse, that because it's on Fox News, that it's got to be true. We have to get people to be thinking analytically and thinking critically, and so it's a certain kind of new literacy movement that we need, that I think needs to be integrated into our political work. Citizenship schools, as they were once called, we need 21st century versions of that. And the printed word is part of that. But it's less about the printed word and more about getting people to think critically. I mean, it's like one of the things that I would never, never have assumed could happen is when you have people that are debating whether the earth is flat. Yeah. Now, in the 21st century. And why? Well, you get some idiot athlete or some other celebrity. I'm not naming names, but you can whistle the tune and I'll acknowledge it. That will say, well, the ideas of a flat earth, it's legitimate. It should be debated. No, it should not be debated. Right? But you get that, and it gets propagated under the rubric of free speech. We get this idea that your opinion is as valuable as my facts. Yeah. And that's part of what we have to integrate into our political work. So I think printed word, I love the printed word. But I think it's more about getting people to think critically about everything, as well as increasingly now critical about what you see. Because with the expansion of AI and other devices, there are things that you can see that do not exist. And it's not simply like when Stalin brushed out Trotsky and other people from photographs in the 1930s. We're talking about a whole different ball of wax on a completely different scale.
No, and I agree with you there especially about the use of AI. It's to the point now where if you're on social media, if you see a picture of anything, you have to have a healthy dose of skepticism in terms of what you're looking at, because there are even history accounts that are using AI imagery. And I'm thinking, this didn't actually happen. Like, what is this that you're showing us?
Right.
So there's a lot of work that we have to do. And I'm also seeing this in the classroom, that our students are coming to us really unsure of what information they can and cannot trust, and they can and cannot find trustworthy. It's a very dangerous situation, especially for trying to build a democratic society. To that end, I do want to get to Diana. She's had her hand up for some time now. So, Diana, please go ahead and ask your question or comment.
Let me come off mute. First of all, thank you so much. I'm in the state of Mississippi. Robert, I have to thank you all again, because I'm so excited. Honestly, I have not seen Bill Fletcher. I heard him in quite a while. And I am just, let me say it in this way. I have to come the way I have to come. If I were in a Pentecostal church, Bill, I would absolutely be doing what they call a Holy Ghost dance and speaking in tongues. If I were in a Baptist church, I'd be shouting and saying amen. If I were in the cultural center that I attend, I would be ashe, ashe, ashe. Because you have articulated so well what my friend said that commented that the books that all the many books that we've read through the years, and you've articulated all of that in this one setting, and I'm just so absolutely excited. And Robert and all of the rest of the Progressive Network, I invited 2 people to attend today, and they're both on, and they're both just as excited as I am. So Bill, of course, we work local, state, national, right?
Right.
Again, understand I'm in the state of Mississippi. And our local work for many years have been around. Well, we began as a racial justice organization in the early 1990s, but I've been in this work since, I've been in the work that I'm doing since I was a young person, because I came out of the Civil Rights 1966 freedom movement here in Grenada, where we integrated the school system, and it was one of the most violent integrations in the nation. So I came out of that history. It is what brought me to this place. It is all of who I am and all of the readings that I've done through the years and all of the work that we've tried to do. So in a local place, and working statewide with an organization that was working in the Mississippi Delta, we understood after some time, because I will have to say the founders who came out of SNCC had a really beautiful and wonderful vision around empowering and building power across the state of Mississippi in terms of Black people. And so what they concluded was that the most critical things, and the thing that touched the most was public education, because of the lack of education that was received by African Americans in the state. So that became the central point of our organizing. And so everything else connected to that. So locally, we have an organization. That organization feeds into the statewide organization. We aligned with groups in terms of coalition building who we knew would not be around public school, pro-public school education, who we knew would not be with us around anything else, right? And so many of those very people are responsible for the majority Republican legislature that we have today, right? So, but we still have a semi-alliance with them around public education.
Mm-hmm.
I haven't seen any movement from them in terms of a broader coalition around what I'm hearing and around what we want, right? And attempting to, well, let me back up, because some of those people, we work with some young people, a young people's group who comes out of around LGBTQ, who are part of the pro-Palestinian movement, right? Mm-hmm. So I can't say that that's all of Mississippi, but I will say that in terms of this particular group that we aligned with around public education, who are considered soccer moms, I would still say the majority of them are part of the right wing, right, in terms of Trumpism and all of the rest. So I don't know. I don't know how we can move. It does not seem like we can move beyond that. And I hear all of what you're saying. I agree with all of what you're saying. And I think the next question for me would be for Robert. This is recorded, and we will be able to share it, right? Correct?
Yes, that is correct.
Okay.
It is being recorded, Shirley.
In some ways, I think that will help, because we were at our Democratic State Convention 2 weeks ago. And I can honestly say, I don't see our Democratic Party in the state of Mississippi, not even nationally really, but in the state of Mississippi, anywhere in terms of what you're saying today, anywhere. I don't see that, right? I cry about that. Those of us who were in the room from Mississippi, right? That's one of our greatest conversations. So, and we're just a local organization, right? So in the scheme of things, we're just a small organization locally. So how do we move to that place? And I guess that's has been a major question for years, and continues to be a major question. As a matter of fact, one of the friends of mine is in the room with me, and he's sitting here pondering over how can we get Bill Fletcher to the community college that I work at. So that's where we are. That's where we are. And I appreciate everything. I'm just so excited. But that's the dilemma.
You've made my day. I'm honored and flattered.
Bill, Diana is the former mayor of Grenada.
I'm even more now honored.
Now the chair of the Southern Partners Fund, the fundraising foundation of 12 Southern states.
So a couple of things. I put my email address in the chat. I'm very easy to reach. The part of what I would say is that I'm going to say something that will sound completely insane. We got to figure out, how do we take over Mississippi? And the problem, and I start there, and I started thinking about this a number of years ago. I was speaking in Texas, and I was being told how bad the situation is in Texas. And I asked people, well, then how do we take over the state? And they thought I was crazy. And I said, no, seriously. If we're not thinking at that level, then why are we doing this? And I said, if we're going to take over, if we're thinking about progressives taking over the state of Texas, we got to think at the level of power and movements, influencers, the whole 9 yards. So we got to think about, what cities do we need? What counties do we need? Which counties can we do without? What are the main instruments through which people get information? What are our strong areas, our base areas? Things like that. I've been saying the same thing in South Carolina, virtually every trip I've made to South Carolina, that we've got to be doing an analysis of the state that is like having up on a wall, a look at the counties, and figure out who's in control, what's their base of support, and what are their weaknesses. So when you mentioned that there are certain groups that you ally with on certain things, but can't on others, I'd say that's fine. There's absolutely nothing wrong with that. That's a good assessment of a particular situation. It's not closing off possibilities. But we've got to think also about who are some of the forces out there, the demographics or organizations that have an interest in winning the same kinds of things that we're interested in winning. Now, I'm not from Mississippi. I'm not from South Carolina. I know it's not going to be easy. I'm not trying to make it easy, but it's a different way of thinking. And so part of that does come to the thing you're raising about the Mississippi Democratic Party. And the question of whether there needs to be a bloc, BLOC, within the Mississippi Democratic Party that does to them what people like Richard Viguerie and others did to the Republican Party in the late 60s, early 70s, where they chased out certain elements. It might be that we've got to chase out certain elements and build a very different kind of Mississippi Democratic Party. So it's that's where, going back to the point that Cecil was raising before about strategy. So strategy begins with that sort of analysis of the state. Now, if we had a Black majority country, or even if the South was a Black majority region, we might be looking at a very different kind of strategy. But we're not. Right? The Mississippi of 2024 is not the Mississippi of 1890. We're looking at very different demographics. So we've got to look very carefully at what's out there, and then what are some of the issues. So there's a lot of white people suffering, a lot. And what do? How can we reach them? So for instance, are there veterans groups that we can either reach or create that can expand to constituencies that we weren't able to get to? I've always said, if you don't organize the veterans and the unemployed, the fascists will. So can we reach out to veterans, particularly white veterans, who are used to operating in very close proximity to Black folks and Latinos and Latinas? Can we reach out to them and build some sort of progressive veterans group in Mississippi that could become part of our base, that could be talking about what's happening, can be talking about how the VA needs to better serve veterans? Can we, so we've got to be thinking much more creatively. That's part of it. Again, it's not easy. There is no silver bullet. There's none. But it begins by analyzing the power that's arrayed against us, but also the power that we ourselves have. When the question about printed information, that raises a very interesting thing. The disappearance of local news. Nationally, there is this real phenomenon of the disappearance of local newspapers. And what's happening is, in the absence of that, we start having much more right-wing AM radio providing news for people. And then you have more conservative news outlets that are consolidating. I don't know what it's like in Mississippi, but one of the things to start looking at would be, do we need to create written news in Mississippi that we start doing the way some of us did years ago when we were selling the Black Panther paper? When you're out there on street corners and you're basically out there selling paper. Now, obviously, it takes money. And, there need to be ads and stuff like that bought, but it's not impossible. And there's actually a whole movement that's been emerging around the country to restore local news. Well, White people in Mississippi need some local news too, but they just need it written by some other people. So I think that there's stuff that we should be thinking about.
You know, I think it's safe to say that every answer that Bill has given us this afternoon could be its own Sunday session in its own right. And he's made some fantastic points this afternoon. And I think this is actually the question I'm about to pose to you now is from the chat. This is from Judith Polson. She poses a question. Nearly all of our legislators are bought, both liberal and conservative. Can we get money out in terms of money in politics? Can we get it out of politics?
Okay, this is tough because once you begin by understanding we're never going to have the same amount of money that the other side does. So we need to get that out of our heads. Now, what we do have are street operations, ground operations. There was an election in Maryland, primary election, and there was this guy running who had a lot of money, and his politics weren't bad, frankly, but he was defeated by someone who had a lot less money. And part of it, I think, was I don't think he had a ground operation. I think that he was relying on money and posters. And one of the things that's been determined, and this is verified time and again, is that if you want people to vote for you, the number one most successful means is face-to-face contact. All other forms decline. Not that they're insignificant, but they decline. So after personal contact from the candidate, then the next most important thing is personal contact from the campaign. And then phone calls, etc. Right? So money is absolutely important. There's no question about it. I'm not denying that. But having a ground operation and having a compelling message. Now, in terms of message, we've got to also understand something from the right who got it from the left, which is that the message is not simply facts, it's storylines. And it's also the ability to listen. For instance, a poll was recently taken that said that more than half of the country believes that we're in a recession. And more than half of the country believes that unemployment is at high levels, record levels. And that's completely wrong. We're not in a recession. We're nowhere near a recession. And unemployment is at record lows. Now, you're not going to be able to convince people of that by simply saying you're wrong. That could be part of it. But you got to listen, because part of what people are saying is that life sucks. That's actually what they're saying. There's a lot of suffering. And so we don't respond to that simply by saying, no, don't you realize? That's part of it. I mean, facts are important. Don't get me wrong. Facts are very important. But they've got to be part of a storyline. And the storyline is that since the mid-1970s, the living standard for the average working person has either been declining or has stagnated. That is what you feel. It ain't about Trump. The economy under Trump improved because of Obama. Didn't improve because of Trump. And so, but what you're feeling is the result of things like the polarization of wealth. What you're feeling is that when the COVID thing struck, the rich were ripping us off. That's what you're feeling. So we've got to present the facts in a storyline, not just throwing things at people to believe. And that's part of how we'll win people over. the right wing is not constrained by the facts, so they can construe all kinds of stories that can be very convincing. One of those was that Obama wasn't really an American. And for many people, that was very convincing because it was done in a really striking way. Trump and others basically kept saying to Obama, prove that you're an American. And when Obama proved it with his birth certificate, what was Trump's response? Well, how do we know that's accurate? Right? So at a certain point, it becomes impossible to make that argument or respond to that argument. But we have to ask people. I mean, I would say to someone about that, look, you're not a stupid person. So let's think about this together for a second and tell me whether I'm wrong. Now, we got one of the most developed intelligence agencies or systems on the planet that knows all kinds of stuff. CIA, FBI, all this stuff. And you're telling me that not one of those agencies would have figured out that Obama wasn't born in the United States, if that was true? You're telling me that no one would have broken that information out? Is that what you're saying? I just want to understand. Are you saying that that only this guy out of New York who has gone bankrupt more often than not, right, that he knows more than the CIA and FBI together? Is that what you're saying? You see what I mean? It's like you got to take people on. And so all of that is part of what has got to be part of our ground operation. Not treating people like they're stupid. Debate them. Challenge them. And also encourage people to read. Goes back to my argument about a new literacy movement.
All right, I think we have a question at the Grow building as well. Please take it away.
Go ahead. Yes, thank you so much for the presentation. I would listen to a sermon this morning and it was like, you know, that's real good. That's wonderful. But this has made it difficult for me to stay in my seat. And I'd be here till tomorrow morning if I gave every response I thought. But I was particularly struck by the discussion of strategy and tactics. And I like to be a critical thinker and I like to be analytical, but I also like to think coloring outside of the lines. Mentioning boycotts really got my attention because I'm looking at how easy the opponent makes it for us, letting us see their strategy. You look at Reconstruction, familiar stuff. Public education, we want to get rid of that. We're working on that. They got voting rights, we want to reverse that. So we can almost predict where they're going to stand, which leads us to know what we are about. Working with people who may disagree with you is incredibly important, but how do we move from this these ideas to actual action? I sat here thinking, boy, if we had a boycott czar in South Carolina and Mississippi, what a wonderful thing it would be. And the would you have me believes got me because I had a discussion just before coming here. I was waiting to hear after the conviction. Would you have me to believe that Joe Biden and the Democratic Party would force you into these court hearings realizing that you might be acquitted with what that would do for your campaign? That should take that away, but we have to figure out a way to move folk away from this, what I call football team politics. This is my side. It makes no difference what they say. It makes no difference what they think. I'm going to believe it. It leads me to imagine Trump, Putin, Kim Jong-un, whoever sitting together and saying, okay, how are we going to do this thing? Well, you turn them against the media. You turn them against each other. You turn them against people coming across your border. You make sure that you have them against you, But how do we get to the point, realizing all of this, that we put something in motion? And I guess it's just hard for my brain to imagine July 2nd being that magic day where it happens, but that's my wish. But I was so excited about the idea, the notion of boycotting, because I've had that discussion for years, even in South Carolina. But there are things that we disagree with other Democrats or with people on the other side, that we can say, hey, let's come together and let's work for this, and then we'll get to the point that we can deal with that. We are totally opposed to genocide in Palestine. We're not going to say that. We're here to help you with your concerns about anti-Semitism and to make sure that we eradicate anti-Semitism, but we're not willing to give up our objection to genocide. And I know I rambled, but I didn't want to stay all night. So thank you.
I appreciate it. And I didn't find it rambling at all. But there's a number of things that you're raising. And I want to start with, when you mentioned the like competing teams, I think that the situation we're in is more akin to the theme from the X-Files. I want to believe that you have, in times of crises, people looking for quick and easy answers and solutions. So in the face of crime, increase cops. In the face of immigration, block the borders, shoot the immigrants. And it's this fear that people have of change and of the unknown. And large numbers of people want to believe, even if what they want to believe in is completely and totally irrational. They want to believe something that touches a part of them. And that's part of what we're up against. That's why, I'll give you an example. Years ago, I took my car. This was at the time that Al Gore's film, The Inconvenient Truth, came out. And I took my car to the shop, and there was a mechanic, really nice guy. And we got into a discussion, and he said that he'd seen the film. And he said it was pretty good. And then he said, but the situation's not that bad. And I said, what do you mean it's not that bad? He says, no, it's not that bad. I said, it's actually worse. He said, no, it can't be that bad. See, think X-Files, right? The thought that the situation is as catastrophic as Al Gore described, even then, was more than this guy wanted to conceive of. Because once he accepts that, then there's other dominoes that start to fall. Like, maybe we got to do something about the economy. Maybe that means something about the way we drive. Maybe something about public transportation. There's all these dominoes that start falling. And so it's much easier to basically say, no, that can't be. That can't possibly be what's going on. I don't know how many of you ever read, or not read, saw the movie The Poseidon Adventure, either the original one in the 70s or the remake from, I think, 10, 15 years ago. But for those of you that didn't see it, let me just tell you the gist of the story. So there's this cruise ship that gets hit by what's called a rogue wave. Rogue wave is this huge wave, usually created by earthquakes. And it turns the ship upside down. So immediately, all these people are killed. But there had been a party going on in the banquet area, and so a large number of people in the banquet area. So Gene Hackman, in the first one, is there, and he quickly realizes that safety will come by getting to what used to be the bottom of the ship, because that's now the only part that's above water. And that if they stay in the banquet area, they're going to die. So he makes this argument to this whole group of people, we've got to get out of here. And there's this huge Christmas tree. And if we climb up it, we'll get to that door, and we can work our way up to the bottom of the ship. So there's a purser there who says, no, we need to wait for the captain. And Gene Hackman says, the captain is probably dead. We can't wait. Time is of the essence. And this person says, no, this is like a bubble. We're going to be safe. We're safe here. We should stay here. So Gene Hackman and all these other stars of the movie, they climb the tree. And it's like about 6 of them. They climb the tree, they get to the top, and everyone else stays down below. They're safe. And then all of a sudden, the water breaks through. And everybody panics. They start running for the tree. They try to get up the tree all at once. The tree falls and they die. And the rest of the people that were Gene Hackman, they have a chance of getting to safety. That's a situation we're in. We're often talking to a lot of people that don't want to believe they need to climb the tree. They want to believe that it's safe to remain where they are, or to go for what the purser is saying, which is just remain cool. Everything's going to be fine. And in our case, the purser is saying, vote for Trump, go with MAGA. Everything will be cool. Let's just retreat to where the period of great safety. The rest of us are saying, we got to climb this damn tree. We've got to get to safety. And that's what we need to be doing, right? That's the essence of what we need to be doing. The people that are prepared to climb the tree, we need to be among them. We need to be leading that process, because there's a lot of people that simply cannot and will not be saved. They just won't be. And whether we're in South Carolina, Mississippi, or New York, there are a lot of people that simply are refusing to understand the gravity of the situation we're in. So we begin with those who understand that there is no safety remaining stationary. That's what we got to do.
All right, we have about 15 minutes left. Any other questions? I have one in particular, but I want to see if there are any other questions from folks in Grow or on the chat. Yes, I see a hand raised in the Grow building. Go ahead, please.
Hey, Bill. First off, thank you. This is amazing. Second off, you rightly mentioned that we're never going to have as much money as the right. And one of the questions that I have is, without being reliant on like this national money that, I don't know, those groups either aren't necessarily for us or are incompetent, how do you pay for all this? The stuff that has to happen. How do we fund this movement?
Well, I'm not going to make any recommendations for anything illegal, particularly since this is being taped. But in all seriousness, see, money is funny and it's very fluid. So I've helped to start a project called Standing for Democracy. And the project that we're just getting off the ground, and it's an anti-fascist worker project. And it's basically, the aim of it is to fight the far right and to win over more and more workers to fight the far right. And so I'm looking for money for this project. Now, there are some foundations and other funders that are out there that have an interest in that. Now, I'm also involved in a project around the Western Sahara, which is largely occupied by Morocco. And I've been involved with that for years and trying to build a campaign to change U.S. foreign policy around that. There's almost no money around. So the thing is that depending on what you're fighting around, there may or may not be money that you can make use of. So you don't close off the possibilities. But the other thing is to try to figure out who out there that may have money, that may be interested in funding part of what you're doing. So a few years ago, I was involved in organizing minor league baseball players. Now, everybody said it could never be done. Everybody, including the Major League Baseball Players Association. They said, no, it couldn't be done. And so me and some other people set up a 501c3, and we started organizing minor league baseball players. And in 2022, we were able to convince the Major League Baseball Players Association to admit minor leaguers, and 5,000 minor league players became unionized. And nobody said it could be done. Nobody. But we were able to get some money from a foundation that happened to believe our message. And they were not convinced it couldn't be done. And with that money, we were able to get going. So it's important to understand that there is money out there. There's not money on the scale of the Koch Foundation, K-O-C-H, right? There is money, and there's people like the Bezos family that has given a lot of money to environmental issues. But we have to think in terms of a different model of raising money, which is about much more at the grassroots level of everything from setting up small businesses to getting financial contributions. Because see, what a lot of us do, good, progressive and left people, is that we rely on the foundations. But so when if the foundations don't come through, then we basically throw our hands in the air and say there's nothing we can do. What progressive movements have often done over time is that they have small contributions from grassroots people. They've set up companies, small businesses that have both employed people but also raised money for the movement. So there are alternative mechanisms that you can utilize to raise resources. There's also in-kind resources that some organizations can offer. You might need administrative help, and you'll get a local trade union that will say, yeah, we'll give you some portion of one of our staff's time for something. So we've just got to be very creative.
Thank you.
No, that was a great question and an excellent response. All right, so there is one last question in the chat from Cecil, and I think this might be our last question for today's session. Cecil mentioned that he has been reading Paulo Freire's Pedagogy of the Oppressed, an excellent read, I might add. How has Freire influenced your own thinking about current trends in the U.S. To privatize education?
Freire was a major Brazilian pedagogue and revolutionary who died, I think, in the 90s. And one of his most famous books was Pedagogy of the Oppressed. Freire hasn't influenced my thinking on privatization, has not. Privatization of education is simply bad, and I knew that before reading Freire and after reading Freire. It's toxic. It is, and it's antithetical to democracy. Freire influenced my thinking on how do you educate adults? And that was the most important thing, to distinguish that education of adults from the education of kids. And that unfortunately, many organizations have treated the education of adults as if they're educating kids, which is relying on speeches, relying on giving people things to read, relying on telling people what to believe, assuming that people are stupid. And what Freire basically said was, adults have come to various conclusions, and some of those conclusions are contradictory. But the adult doesn't necessarily see them as contradictory, but they're contradictory. And the adults have various experiences. And so when you're educating people, part of what you're doing as an adult progressive educator is that you're doing two things. You're tapping into the thinking and experiences of the person being educated, and you're introducing new information. And that latter point is very important, because tapping into what people know or think that they know is insufficient, because people often have completely wrong ideas, like the world is flat, right? Or that Trump is a good businessman. And so you need to challenge that by first acknowledging that's what they believe in, and then take them on and introduce new information. I'll give you an example. So about a year ago, I was doing a program for this progressive nonprofit organization, and it was on racial justice. And so one of the participants said something like this. We were talking about the issue of white privilege. And she said, well, I know that the concept of white privilege was actually invented by this white woman in the 90s, but I think it's still valuable. And blah, 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 blah. And I said, well, that's not correct. It wasn't invented by a white woman. I said, you could actually take the idea of white privilege back to Lenin, and maybe even before that, but certainly to Lenin, with the whole notion of national privilege. And the term white privilege was used regularly in the 1960s and 1970s. And it's been resuscitated and popularized for sure since then. So the woman looked at me as if I had just started speaking Mandarin. And so that was it, at least so I thought. So I came back to the next session of the training, and before the session started, one of the senior staff people said, Bill, you know, there's some of the staff that are upset with you. I said, why? They said, well, the way you responded to such and such's comment. I said, well, what about it? They said, well, they felt that you really needed to validate her views. I said, what was I supposed to say? Wow, that's a brilliant observation, except it's completely wrong. I mean, what was I supposed to say? And see, the problem is that there's many people now that really do believe that their opinion is as valuable as the facts. It's as legitimate. And that it was wrong for me to have said, hey, you got the facts wrong. No, that is not wrong to do. That people, the fact that someone believes something does not mean it's legitimate. It means that they believe it. What you do afterwards is the question. Years ago, I was a shipyard worker. I was a welder. And there was this white guy who was a union member. And, you know, he was relatively good on union issues. He had been a roofer before that, et cetera. And we got along fine. And so we're talking, and somehow the topic of interracial relationships came up. And this white guy says to me, if I had a daughter and she married a black man, I would disown her. Now I'm sitting there. Now, y'all see what I look like. I know I'm light-skinned. I realize that. I appreciate that. But in the United States, there's no one that really would raise a question. It may be in Venezuela or Colombia, they'd say, all right, I'm not sure you're black. But in the United States, no, people know I'm black. This white guy says to me that, but he didn't say it to insult me. That was what was amazing. He said it as if he was saying to me, the sun will rise tomorrow at 6. The guy believed it. It was a completely off the wall view. Now the question is, what do I do with it? Do I say to him, you racist SOB, I'm gonna throw this thing at you? What do I do with it? And that's where education comes in. That's what I learned from Freire.
All right, and that is a great way for us to finish up today. Brett, I know you want to have some closing remarks, so please go right ahead.
Thank you, Robert. I just wanted to say that those of us that have been going to the Modjeska School for the last decade realize my cover's blown. We've been cribbing off of Bill Fletcher for many years now, because we're actually teaching many of the things that Bill's talking about and putting them into practice here with a state-based analysis that we're trying to create a self-sustaining movement. And I just wanted to let people know that we have Bill's books here, and if you're interested and need a copy and can't find it, just respond to any of our emails from the network email address. And then our class tomorrow picks up and builds on what Bill was talking about, and talking about the rise of the new left in South Carolina. And so, Bill, as always, I stand in awe of your clarity, because my mushed up thinking just gets clearer and clearer every time I listen to you, sir. And so thank you so much. And Dr. Green, take us home.
Thank you.
All right. Once again, Bill, thank you so much for joining us this afternoon. I think we should have titled your talk, How a Klingon Builds a Social Justice Movement, because a lot of it was very much laser focused, like any warrior would be. But again, thank you so much. This is going to be one of those recordings I'm going to come back to time and time again, because Bill has said a lot of important things for us this evening. And it'll be important for us in tomorrow's class as we cover both the rise of the new left in South Carolina and also the rise of the new right, themes that Bill talked a lot about this afternoon. And we'll bring them closer to home tomorrow evening at 6:30 for the Modjeska Simkins School of Human Rights. We'll only have a handful of sessions left. We're almost at graduation. So again, buckle up, folks. This is where the rubber hits the road. So again, thank you so much, Bill. Thank you, everyone, for joining us this evening. And I'll see a lot of you tomorrow evening and for the rest of the semester. So thank you. Have a
Thank you very much.
Bill.
Thank you, Bill. Thank you, South Carolina Progressive Network.